It was the moment Washington whispered about but never expected to see. The untouchable speaker, cornered not by a political rival, but by simple arithmetic. The air in the Senate Banking Committee hearing room didn't just buzz with anticipation. It vibrated with the kind of high-frequency tension usually reserved for the final moments of a courtroom drama. Cameras lined the back wall, a phalanx of mechanical eyes, their red recording lights casting an ominous, unblinking glow across the polished mahogany tables. This wasn't just another dry, procedural hearing on ethics and transparency. Everyone in the room, from the nervous staffers clutching phones to the seasoned reporters typing furiously in the back, knew that the script was about to be flipped. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi walked to the witness table with the practiced ease of royalty inspecting the troops. She carried the confidence of someone who had navigated Washington's treacherous waters for 37 years and never once drowned. Dressed in a tailored suit of her signature purple, her posture was erect, defying her 84 years. She looked every inch the titan of legislative maneuvering who had stared down presidents, outlasted critics, and controlled the gavel with an iron grip. To the casual observer, she appeared invincible, shielded by decades of established power and protocol. Across from her, Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana presented a jarring visual contrast. If Pelosi was polished marble, Kennedy was weathered oak. He sat quietly at the committee table, his white hair slightly disheveled in that approachable, unkempt way that made folks back home trust him more than the slick politicians in expensive haircuts. He wasn't posturing for the cameras or checking his reflection. Instead, he was organizing a stack of manila folders with the methodical, plodding precision of a small-town accountant preparing for tax season. His reading glasses were perched precariously on the end of his nose, and when he looked up, his expression carried the mild curiosity of a man who had just noticed something mildly interesting in the newspaper, rather than a man about to dissect a political legacy. For years, the D.C. elite had dismissed him. They saw the folksy demeanor, heard the thick Louisiana drawl that stretched syllables like taffy, and comfortably labeled him a dumb hillbilly. It was a comforting lie they told themselves to underestimate him. But anyone who had actually watched Kennedy operate knew that the confused country lawyer persona was the most dangerous weapon in the Senate. It was a carefully constructed mask that concealed the razor-sharp mind of an Oxford-educated lawyer who had spent 17 years managing Louisiana's finances as state treasurer. He understood numbers better than he understood politics. And today, the folders sitting in front of him weren't just props, they were receipts. The hearing topic was officially listed as Ethics and Transparency in Congressional Financial Dealings. It sounded innocuous enough, boring even. But the subtext was screaming. There was a mystery hanging in the air, a mathematical impossibility that no amount of political spin could explain away. How does a public servant, earning a government salary, amass a net worth approaching nearly $500 million? It is a question that has haunted the halls of the Capitol for decades, usually whispered in private or shouted on the fringes of the internet. But today, the question wasn't going to remain on the fringe. In the next few minutes, the world wasn't just going to watch a hearing. They were going to witness the dissection of a 37-year illusion. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and suffocating. Pelosi smiled graciously, ready for the usual softballs, her demeanor suggesting she expected to be out of there in time for a late lunch. Kennedy didn't smile back. He just adjusted his glasses, tapping the edge of the first folder in his stack, a folder that contained a financial history that simply didn't add up, and cleared his throat. He looked up over the rim of his spectacles, his voice breaking the silence with a tone that sounded like molasses, thick and sweet, effectively hiding the steel trap he was about to spring. The math problem, 292% returns, and the folksy trap. Madam Speaker, Congresswoman Pelosi, Kennedy began, the words rolling out of his mouth with the slow, deliberate cadence of a paddle boat pushing against a lazy current. He stretched the syllables like taffy, pulling them until they were thin and sweet, disarming in their apparent simplicity. I do appreciate you joining us today. I know you're a busy woman. It was a masterclass in tactical humility. To the uninitiated, he sounded like a grandfather asking for directions to the nearest fishing hole. To those who knew the game, it was the sound of a trap being baited. Pelosi, for her part, maintained her poise, offering a gracious, practiced smile. "Thank you, Senator," she replied, her voice clipped and professional. "I'm always happy to discuss transparency in government." "Well, now that's good to hear, ma'am. Real good." Kennedy adjusted his glasses again, a gesture that seemed to emphasize his supposed befuddlement. He pulled out the first document from his stack, holding it as if it were written in a foreign language he was trying desperately to decipher. See, I've been looking at some numbers, and I'm what you might call confused. Now, I'm just a country lawyer from Louisiana, so maybe you can help me understand something. With a nod to his aide, a chart appeared on the large overhead screen behind the witness table. It was simple, stark, and devastating. 2 columns of numbers glowed in high definition, impossible to ignore. On the left, labeled 1,987, was the figure $2,700,000. On the right, labeled current estimate, the numbers ballooned into the stratosphere, ranging between $250 million and $400 million. According to public records, when you first entered Congress in 1987, your net worth was approximately $2.7 million, Kennedy narrated, turning to look at the screen as if seeing it for the first time himself. That's a right healthy sum, don't get me wrong. Nothing to sneeze at. Pelosi nodded slightly, her expression unreadable. My husband Paul has always been a successful businessman, she interjected, a standard defense she had used 1,000 times before. Yes, ma'am, I'm sure he has been. Kennedy's tone remained pleasant, bordering on conversational. He turned back to her, his brow furrowed in exaggerated concentration. Now, here's where I get a little turned around in my thinking. Your most recent financial disclosures show a net worth of, well, estimates vary, but most put it somewhere between $250 million and $400 million. The numbers hung in the air like the heavy humidity of a Louisiana afternoon. In the hearing room, the silence deepened. The sheer scale of the wealth accumulation, when visualized so bluntly, was breathtaking. It wasn't just wealth, it was an empire. Kennedy let the silence stretch for a beat, allowing the audience to do the mental math, before he continued in that same unhurried drawl. So, that's an increase of, and I had my staff check my arithmetic, because math was never my strong suit, approximately 292% over 37 years. He looked up from his papers with an expression of genuine, wide-eyed bewilderment. Ma'am, I'm wondering if you could help educate this committee on how a person might accomplish that while earning a government salary? Because I've been in public service for a good while now, and I'll be honest with you, I haven't figured out that particular trick. A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Several committee members chuckled, and even the press corps exchanged amused glances. Kennedy was playing the fool to perfection, inviting the room to laugh at his expense, all while planting a devastating seed of doubt. The premise was absurd on its face. A public servant outperforming the world's best hedge fund managers by simply saving her salary. Pelosi's smile tightened, just a fraction. The corners of her mouth held firm, but her eyes narrowed. She recognized the game now, but her response was locked into the official narrative she had adhered to for years. Senator, as I've stated many times, my husband manages our family's investments through his firm, Financial Leasing Services. I don't personally own any stocks. We comply fully with all disclosure requirements under the law. It was the polished, rehearsed line of a veteran politician. It was legally sound, technically accurate, and designed to shut down inquiry. She was banking on the fact that technically following the rules was the same as being ethical. Oh, I'm sure you do, ma'am. I'm sure you do. Kennedy nodded slowly, the way one might acknowledge a child explaining why the sky is green, patient, understanding, but entirely unconvinced. The law says you have to disclose, and you disclose. That's following the letter of the law. No question about it. He paused, letting her feel a moment of relief. It seemed, for a fleeting second, that he was accepting her explanation. He was acknowledging her compliance. The tension in her shoulders seemed to drop an inch. But that was the mistake. Kennedy wasn't retreating. He was merely securing the perimeter before launching the main assault. He reached for another folder, this one significantly thicker than the first. The playful confusion began to evaporate from his eyes, replaced by a glint of something far sharper. But see, what interests me isn't whether you followed disclosure rules, he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing just a hint of the country bumpkin affectation. What interests me is the substance of those disclosures. He opened the folder, the sound of the paper shuffling echoing in the quiet room. The actual trades your husband made, their timing relative to your legislative activities, that sort of thing. He pulled out a document, and even from the back of the room, the logo at the top was unmistakable. It wasn't a spreadsheet of general assets anymore. It was a specific trade record, stamped with the branding of a major tech giant. Kennedy looked up, his reading glasses sliding down his nose again, peering at her with the intensity of a prosecutor who has just found the murder weapon. "Let's start with a company called Nvidia," he said, pronouncing the name carefully, ensuring every syllable landed with the weight of an accusation. "You familiar with them?" The trap had snapped shut. The generalities were over. Kennedy wasn't asking for education anymore. He was demanding answers about a coincidence so precise it defied belief. The Nvidia coincidence, $1 million bet, and the CHIPS Act. Congresswoman Pelosi shifted slightly in her chair, the purple fabric of her suit rustling against the microphone. "They're a technology company," she replied, her voice steady but cautious, like a person walking across a frozen pond who just heard a crack. "Semiconductors, I believe." "Yes, ma'am. That's right. Semiconductors." Kennedy pronounced each syllable with exaggerated care, savoring the word as if it were an exotic dish he was tasting for the first time. "Now, let me ask you about July of 2022. Do you remember what Congress was voting on that month?" Pelosi hesitated. July 2022 was a lifetime ago in political years, a blur of legislative maneuvering and midterm election prep. "Senator, that was over 2 years ago." The CHIPS and Science Act, Kennedy supplied helpfully, cutting through the fog of memory with the precision of a scalpel. He didn't look at his notes, he looked directly at her. $52 billion in subsidies to the semiconductor industry. Companies like Nvidia, Intel, AMD. You were Speaker of the House at the time. You publicly championed that bill, called it essential for American competitiveness. "That's correct," she affirmed, finding her footing on the solid ground of policy. "It was important legislation." "Important indeed." Kennedy nodded, his expression grave. "Now, here's the interesting part. And this is where I need your help understanding the coincidence. That same month, the very month you were whipping votes for a $52 billion handout to the chip industry, your husband exercised call options to purchase 25,000 shares of Nvidia stock, a transaction with a value of over $1 million. The room went deathly quiet. The scratching of pens on notepads stopped. The only sound was the hum of the ventilation system and the rapid-fire clicking of shutters from the back of the room. Kennedy peered at Pelosi over the rim of his reading glasses, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Now, Congresswoman, I'm sure that was just a coincidence," he continued, his voice dripping with Southern hospitality that felt more like an interrogation. "Your husband, who you live with, who you share meals with, who's been married to you for over 60 years. He just happened to make $1 million bet on semiconductors right before you voted to give them $52 billion in taxpayer money." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke. Then, with perfect deadpan delivery, he added, "That's what we call good timing back in Louisiana." A wave of nervous laughter rippled through the gallery. It wasn't the laughter of amusement. It was the laughter of shock. Pelosi's jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath the skin. "Senator, my husband makes his own investment decisions. I have no involvement." "Oh, I believe you, ma'am. I surely do." Kennedy's expression remained guileless, a mask of innocent belief. "But here's what I find real interesting about this particular trade." He pulled out another document, this one featuring a jagged stock chart that looked like a staircase to heaven. "After the public caught wind of your husband's perfectly timed purchase, there was quite a bit of fuss about it. Ethics questions, media attention, that sort of thing. It didn't look good. So, what did your husband do?" Kennedy looked up, eyebrows raised in innocent inquiry. "He sold all 25,000 shares. He took a loss of $341,365. Kennedy shook his head sympathetically. "That's a substantial loss by most folks' standards. That's a mortgage. That's a college education. Gone." He then pulled up the current Nvidia stock price on the screen behind him. The line on the chart went vertical. "Now, here's the real head-scratcher. If your husband had held on to those shares, if he'd just weathered the criticism and kept his nerve, they'd be worth about $12,200,000 today." He let the number sink in. $12 million. He missed out on $8,200,000 in profit. Kennedy leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, delivering his assessment with the timing of a championship debater who had learned his craft in the lecture halls of Oxford, not the back rooms of the Bayou. "So, let me see if I understand this correctly, ma'am. Your husband had access to information about legislation affecting semiconductors. He made a perfectly timed trade. He got caught. He panic sold at a $300,000 loss and missed out on $8 million. He looked directly at Pelosi, his expression utterly sincere, void of any malice, which made the next words land with the force of a sledgehammer. "Congresswoman, That's not insider trading. That's just bad insider trading. The gallery erupted. It wasn't just a chuckle this time. It was a release of tension that had been building since the hearing began. Committee members struggled to maintain their composure. Even some Democratic staffers behind Pelosi covered their mouths to hide betraying smiles. Pelosi's face flushed a deep crimson, her composure cracking for the first time. The insult was specific and devastating. It attacked not just her ethics, but her competence. It framed the corruption not as a master plan, but as a clumsy, greedy grab that backfired. Kennedy allowed himself a small, fleeting smile, then continued as if he had said nothing remarkable. He wasn't done. The laughter died down, replaced by a new, heavier silence. The room realized that the Nvidia story wasn't just an anecdote, it was the opening salvo of a much larger bombardment. But that's not even the most interesting part of the Nvidia story, Kennedy said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Would you like to hear the rest? Before Pelosi could respond, Kennedy pulled out another disclosure form. This one was dated December 2023. Because your husband got back into Nvidia, November 2023, purchased 50 call options, strike price of $120, transaction value between $1 million and $5 million. He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. He made over $1 million in 73 days. That's 4.75 times your congressional salary, earned in less than 3 months on one trade. Kennedy paused, then added thoughtfully, "Now, when did you disclose this particular trade to the public?" He held up the form, pointing to the date stamp. December 22nd, 2023. That's the Friday right before Christmas weekend, when everybody's traveling to see family, when newsrooms are running skeleton crews, when nobody is watching. His tone remained pleasant, almost chatty, but the steel was unmistakable now. Now I'm just a simple man from Louisiana, but where I come from, we call that timing. Some folks might call it something else. They might call it, what's the word I'm looking for? He appeared to search the ceiling for the right term, then snapped his fingers. Deceptive. That's the word. Deceptive. The room had gone completely silent. Every camera focused on Pelosi's face, searching for a reaction, a defense, anything. But there was nothing. Kennedy closed the Nvidia folder with a soft thud that echoed like a gavel. He reached for the next one in the stack, a folder labeled Visa. "But we're just getting started, Congresswoman," he said, opening the file with the unhurried deliberation of a man who had all afternoon and nothing better to do than ask uncomfortable questions. "We haven't even talked about credit cards yet. The pattern emerges: Visa, Big Tech, and the Christmas dump." Kennedy let the laughter die down, but he didn't let the pressure drop. The bad insider trading line had drawn blood, cracking the facade of competence, but he wasn't interested in just a flesh wound. He was going for the bone. "But that's not even the most interesting part of the Nvidia story," Kennedy said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that silenced the room instantly. "Would you like to hear the rest?" He didn't wait for an answer. He pulled out another disclosure form, this one dated December 2023. "Because your husband got back into Nvidia, November 2023. He purchased 50 call options. And this time, he didn't panic." Kennedy looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. "He made over $1 million in 73 days. That's 4.75 times your annual congressional salary, earned in less than 3 months on a single trade." Kennedy paused, holding the paper up to the light as if inspecting a counterfeit bill. "Now, when did you disclose this particular trade to the public?" "December 22nd, 2023. He checked the calendar on the wall, pantomiming a realization. "That's the Friday right before Christmas weekend. That's when everybody is traveling to see family. That's when newsrooms are running skeleton crews. That's when you release news you hope nobody reads." His tone remained pleasant, almost chatty, but the steel was unmistakable now. "Now I'm just a simple man from Louisiana, but where I come from, we call that timing. Some folks might call it something else. They might call it, what's the word I'm looking for?" He appeared to search the ceiling for the right term, then snapped his fingers. "Deceptive. That's the word. Deceptive." The room had gone completely silent. Every camera focused on Pelosi's face, searching for a reaction, a defense, anything. But there was nothing. Kennedy closed the Nvidia folder with a soft thud that echoed like a gavel. He reached for the next one in the stack, a folder labeled Visa. "But we're just getting started, Congresswoman," he said, opening the file with the unhurried deliberation of a man who had all afternoon and nothing better to do than ask uncomfortable questions. "We haven't even talked about credit cards yet." Kennedy pulled the visa documents toward him, glancing at the papers and then back at Pelosi with that same mild, almost apologetic curiosity. "Congresswoman, let's talk about another one of your husband's trades. This one's more recent, so maybe the details will be fresher in your memory." He signaled to the aide, and a new transaction report appeared on the screen. July 2024. Your husband sold 2,000 shares of Visa Incorporated. The disclosure lists the value as between $500,000 and $1 million. Based on the date and the stock price, it looks like about $526,000. Kennedy looked up. "Now, can you tell this committee why your husband decided to sell his Visa stock in July?" "Senator, as I've explained, I don't involve myself in my husband's investment decisions." Right. You've said that." Kennedy waved a hand as if brushing away a bothersome fly. "But here's what I find curious about the timing." He pulled up a news headline dated September 24th, 2024, 2 months later. Just 2 months, mind you. The Department of Justice filed a massive civil antitrust lawsuit against Visa, accusing them of illegally monopolizing the debit card market. The stock dropped 5% that day. Kennedy removed his glasses and looked directly at Pelosi, stripping away the folksy veneer for a brief second. "So, your husband sold $500,000 worth of Visa stock 2 months before the DOJ filed a major lawsuit against the company." Another remarkable piece of timing. He put his glasses back on and shuffled through more papers. "But maybe that's just 2 coincidences. Maybe you're just lucky. So let me tell you what I did. I had my staff go through all your financial disclosures over the past 5 years. Every stock trade your husband made. And you know what we found?" Kennedy pulled out a comprehensive timeline and displayed it on the screen. It was a kaleidoscope of logos and dates, a visual map of uncanny foresight. 20-plus trades, each marked with dates and corresponding legislative or regulatory events. He pointed to the first entry. June 2021. Your husband exercised Alphabet, that's Google call options, for over $5 million. 1 week later, the House Judiciary Committee advanced antitrust legislation targeting big tech companies. Your husband made $5.3 million on that trade. He moved his finger down the list, reciting the hits like a litany. Microsoft options exercised right before a major federal contract announcement. Tesla sold before production issues became public. Apple purchases ahead of regulatory changes favorable to the company. Kennedy looked up from the timeline, his voice taking on the cadence of a professor lecturing a particularly dense class. "Now, Congresswoman, I took statistics at Vanderbilt University. Got an A, if memory serves, though that was a long time ago. And I can tell you that the odds of getting all these trades right, timing the market this perfectly, this consistently just by luck." He shook his head slowly, the ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "Well, ma'am, you'd have better odds of winning the lottery twice in the same week, while being struck by lightning." Several committee members couldn't suppress their laughter. Pelosi gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, the purple fabric of her sleeves straining against the tension in her arms. "Senator Kennedy, these accusations are baseless," she snapped, her voice tight. Kennedy's eyebrows rose in genuine-seeming surprise. "Ma'am, I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm just reading from your own financial disclosure forms. These are your numbers, your trades, your timing." He let the heavy silence return, letting the weight of the coincidences settle on the room before he reached for the final piece of his puzzle, a folder that didn't contain numbers, but photographs. Report. Paul Pelosi sold over $500K in Visa stock before DOJ antitrust lawsuit. This video provides specific details regarding the timeline of Paul Pelosi's Visa stock sale and the subsequent DOJ antitrust lawsuit, which reinforces the pattern Kennedy is highlighting in this section. Report. Paul Pelosi sold over $500K in Visa stock before DOJ antitrust lawsuit vs. YouTube. Straight Arrow News 2, 8K views. A Tale of Two Cities. The Mansion versus the Tents. "See, here's what troubles me," Kennedy said, his voice dropping to a lower, more somber register. He organized his papers with deliberate care, creating a perfectly square stack before clasping his hands on top of them. The playful confusion was gone. The prosecutorial edge had softened into something that looked, unsettlingly, like pity. "You've served in Congress for 37 years. You've represented the great city of San Francisco all that time, and I think it might be instructive to look at how that city has fared while you've been getting wealthier." Kennedy reached for a new folder. This one didn't contain spreadsheets or stock tickers. It contained photographs. "Let's talk about San Francisco, shall we?" He pulled out a series of glossy, high-resolution images and signaled for them to be displayed on the overhead screen. The first image was a punch to the gut. It showed a street corner in the Tenderloin district. Tents lined the sidewalk, a patchwork shanty town of blue tarps and cardboard, extending as far as the camera lens could see. Human figures lay prone on the concrete, surrounded by the debris of survival shopping carts, trash bags, and makeshift shelters. "Congresswoman, you've represented San Francisco since 1987, Kennedy said, looking at the screen rather than at her. That's 37 years. How would you say the city is doing? Before Pelosi could answer, before she could launch into a prepared statement about the complexities of urban housing or federal funding shortfalls, Kennedy clicked a button. A new photo appeared. This one depicted an open-air drug market in broad daylight. People were openly using needles. Others were slumped over in the narcotic fentanyl fold, oblivious to the world around them. According to reports, homelessness in your district has skyrocketed during your tenure. Drug overdose deaths reached an all-time high last year. Businesses are fleeing in record numbers, leaving behind boarded-up storefronts in ghost towns where commerce used to thrive. Crime statistics would make folks in most American cities weep. He turned from the images of urban decay to look directly at the woman who had presided over this era. But here's what I find peculiar. While San Francisco has been, shall we say, experiencing some difficulties, your personal net worth has gone from $2.7 million to over $250 million. Kennedy paused, letting the contrast settle. It seems like one of those things is going in the wrong direction, wouldn't you say? Pelosi opened her mouth to respond, likely to pivot to national policy, but Kennedy was already moving. He wasn't interested in a debate on urban planning. He was painting a portrait of disconnection. Now, let's talk about where you live when you're in San Francisco. Your primary residence is in the Pacific Heights neighborhood. Beautiful area. One of the most exclusive in the city. He pulled out property records, holding them up like a travel brochure. Your home is valued at somewhere between $25 and $30 million. A red brick mansion, panoramic views of the San Francisco Bay. It's in a neighborhood where the average home costs $8 million, where security is tight, where, funny thing, you don't see many homeless encampments. He stacked another document on top. Then there's your Napa Valley vineyard, estimated value $6 to $8 million. Includes actual vineyards, a guest house, beautiful rolling hills, a nice place to escape the city when things get a bit too real. Another document. Georgetown House in Washington, D.C. $3 million. Close to Capitol Hill. Very convenient. He added more papers to the pile, building a physical tower of assets. Commercial properties in San Francisco, ownership stakes in high-end real estate partnerships. All told, we're looking at about $40 million in real estate alone. Kennedy leaned back, his expression one of mild curiosity, as if he were trying to solve a riddle. Congresswoman, you give speeches about fighting for working families. You give speeches about the affordable housing crisis. You give speeches about income inequality. These are fine speeches, very moving. But I'm curious, which working families live in $30 million mansions? He didn't wait for an answer. The average rent in San Francisco is $3,500 a month. Your property taxes on your Pacific Heights home alone could house a dozen families for a year. The working people you claim to represent can't afford to live in the city you represent, but you're doing just fine. Kennedy then reached for his phone, a modern prop in this old-fashioned dismantling. In fact, he said, tapping the screen, I recall a moment during the COVID pandemic, April 2020, while small businesses in your district were being forced to close, while working families were struggling to pay rent and waiting in food lines. You posted a video tour of your kitchen. A clip played on the monitors. It was the infamous appearance on a late-night talk show. There was Pelosi, standing in front of a Sub-Zero refrigerator that cost more than many cars, cheerfully displaying her survival rations, a drawer filled entirely with gourmet ice cream. Jenny's Splendid Ice Creams, $12 a pint. You showed off your fancy ice cream collection, Kennedy narrated, his voice devoid of humor. $12 a pint, kept in a $24,000 freezer. We have chocolate, we have candy, you said. The video cut to images of unemployment lines from the same week. And then, Kennedy continued, while salons were closed under lockdown orders, you supported orders that bankrupted hairdressers and barbers across your state. You went to your salon to get your hair done. He looked at her, eyebrows raised. When you got caught on security cameras, do you remember what you said? Pelosi stared straight ahead, her face a mask of stone. You said you were set up, Kennedy reminded her. You said your hairdresser set you up by doing your hair while every other salon in San Francisco was closed by your lockdown orders. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound disappointment. Ma'am, that's not being set up. That's called rules for thee, but not for me. The gallery was completely silent now. The laughter regarding the stock trades had evaporated, replaced by a tense, heavy atmosphere. This wasn't about math anymore. It was about morality. It was about the fundamental breach of the contract between a representative and the represented. But you know what really gets me? Kennedy's voice took on a harder edge, though he never raised the volume. It's the disconnect. You preach about economic justice while living like royalty. You lecture about climate change while owning multiple mansions. You talk about transparency while disclosing stock trades on Friday afternoons before holiday weekends. He organized his papers with deliberate care, tapping the edges until they were perfectly aligned. And when people started asking questions, when regular folks noticed that something didn't smell quite right, you know what you said? We're a free market economy. As if the market were free when the people making the rules are also making millions trading on those same rules. He looked at the tower of evidence he had built, the stock charts, the property records, the photos of the tents and the mansions. It was a monument to a career that had become indistinguishable from a business enterprise. You've built a wall around yourself, Congresswoman, Kennedy said softly. A wall of money and influence and carefully worded denials. But the problem with walls is that eventually, people start writing on them. He pushed the stack of photos away, leaving the image of the San Francisco street corner lingering on the screen, a ghost haunting the hearing room. He then picked up a piece of legislation, a bill that had been floating around the Senate, gathering dust until this very moment. And speaking of writing, Kennedy said, holding the paper up to the light, some of your colleagues have decided to write something specifically for you. They even put your name on it. The Pelosi Act and the market that mocks the makers. In fact, Kennedy continued, reaching for yet another document, his voice a low rumble that carried to the back of the room. Your trading was so concerning, so prolific, that one of my colleagues, Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, felt compelled to introduce legislation specifically to address it, Bill number S. 3339. He held up the bill, angling it so the cameras could catch the title. The bold letters were visible even from the gallery. Do you know what it's called? Kennedy asked, though he clearly didn't expect an answer. The Pelosi Act. He spelled it out slowly, savoring each letter as if tasting a fine wine. PELOSI stands for Preventing Elected Leaders from Owning Securities and Investments. They named a bill to ban congressional stock trading after you, Congresswoman. Kennedy shook his head in mock admiration. Now, I've been in Congress a while, and I've had some bills passed, but I've never had one named after me. That's quite an honor. The deadpan delivery was perfection. Even some Democrats in the gallery had to look away to hide their smiles. It was a brutal kind of fame to become the eponym for corruption in real time. Pelosi tried to respond, her voice thin. That bill was a political stunt. A stunt. Kennedy's tone remained mild, though his eyes were hard. Maybe so, ma'am. Maybe so. But you know what's not a stunt? This. He signaled to the aide, and a stock ticker symbol appeared on the screen. NANC. This is the unusual Wales Subversive Democratic Trading ETF, Kennedy explained, gesturing to the screen. You know what they call it for short? NANC, as in Nancy. It's an exchange-traded fund that tracks your stock trades. People actually pay money to copy your investments because your returns consistently beat the market. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting to one of genuine wonderment. Now, Warren Buffett is arguably the greatest investor in American history. The man's been studying markets for 70 years. He started reading financial statements when most boys were reading comic books. He lives and breathes this stuff. He pointed a finger at her, not aggressively, but with a steady, unyielding pressure. And your husband, a venture capitalist with no particular expertise in semiconductor technology, or antitrust law, or federal contracting procedures, somehow beats Warren Buffett's returns. Kennedy let that hang there. The absurdity of it, the impossibility of it. In 2023 alone, he continued, glancing at his notes, your portfolio returned 54%. The S&P 500 returned about 26%. You didn't just beat the market average, ma'am. You doubled it. Hedge fund managers with teams of analysts, artificial intelligence, inside corporate access, they wish they could achieve those returns. But somehow, your husband does it year after year. He looked at Pelosi with that innocent, questioning expression again. Ma'am, how do you explain that? Is he just the luckiest man on earth? Or does he have an edge that Warren Buffett doesn't? Pelosi opened her mouth, closed it, and then opened it again. She looked like a fish out of water, gasping for air. My husband has been very successful in his business ventures, she stammered. Yes, ma'am, he certainly has been, Kennedy replied, his tone carrying a hint of something that might have been sympathy, or perhaps just pity. But that's not really an answer to my question, is it? He organized his papers, taking his time, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. See, here's the thing about free markets, Kennedy said, pivoting back to her earlier defense. You said, we are a free market economy. We should be able to participate in that. But ma'am, a free market relies on a level playing field. It relies on everyone having access to the same information at the same time. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. When you know which bills are coming up for a vote, when you participate in classified briefings about national security and economic policy, when you vote on regulations that directly affect specific companies, and then you trade on that information, ma'am, that's not a free market. That's a rigged market. The words landed like a hammer. The distinction was clear, moral, and absolute. And the American people know it, Kennedy added. That's why there's an ETF named after you. Not because they admire your policy, but because they know the game is rigged, and they just want a piece of the action. He stood up for the first time in the hearing, his full height commanding the room's attention. This was a signal everyone recognized. Kennedy was building to something final. The folksy charm was evaporating, replaced by the steely resolve of a man who had seen enough. Congresswoman Pelosi, he said, his voice ringing with authority, I'm going to be real straight with you now. I'm going to drop the folksy routine for just a minute. The closing argument. 5 points of prosecution. Kennedy held up the index finger of his right hand, counting off the charges with the methodical precision of a metronome. Point 1. You and your husband have made over $250 million, while you voted on legislation affecting the very companies you were trading. Nvidia before the CHIPS Act, Visa before the DOJ lawsuit, Google before antitrust actions. The timing is too perfect, too consistent, too profitable to be mere luck. He raised a second finger. Point 2. When asked about banning this practice, you defended it as free market capitalism. But ma'am, when you know what's coming before the market knows, when you vote on the very regulations that affect stock prices, that's not a free market. That's insider knowledge. It's a rigged game, and you're the dealer. A third finger joined the count. Point 3. You disclose these trades on Friday afternoons before holiday weekends, using every legal trick in the book to minimize media coverage. That's not transparency. That's covering your tracks. That's hoping the American people are too busy with their families to notice you picking their pockets. Point 4. Kennedy continued, his voice rising slightly, still controlled but vibrating with unmistakable conviction. The city you've represented for 37 years is falling apart. Homelessness, drugs, crime, businesses fleeing. But you've never been richer. Your constituents can't afford rent, but you're buying vineyards. The disconnect is not just economic, it's moral. He paused, letting the weight of that statement hang in the air. Point 5. When confronted with these facts, you hide behind your husband. I don't own any stocks, you say. As if the American people are stupid enough to believe you don't talk to your husband of 60 years about his million-dollar trades in companies you regulate. Kennedy placed both hands flat on the table, leaning forward until he was almost looming over the witness table. Ma'am, I can't prove you broke any laws. The laws were written by people like you, to protect people like you. But I can prove something else. The room was deathly silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to have paused. I can prove you've made a mockery of public service. You've enriched yourself while cities crumble. You've defended a system that lets elected officials trade on insider knowledge while calling it capitalism. And you've done it all while preaching about helping working families. Kennedy's voice dropped to a near whisper, but in the acoustically perfect hearing room, every word carried like a thunderclap. Back home in Louisiana, we have a saying, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. You've shown us who you are, Congresswoman, an elected official who got very, very rich, while the people you represent got very, very poor. He straightened up, his expression conveying something between disappointment and disgust. Now, I can't prove you broke any laws because, like I said, you helped write those laws. But I'll tell you what I can prove. You've turned public service into a profit center. You've used your position to enrich yourself. And when people noticed, You had the gall to call it free market capitalism. Kennedy picked up his papers, tapping them into a neat stack on the mahogany table. The sound was sharp, final. Ma'am, where I come from, we call that shameful. The word hung in the air like a verdict. Shameful. It wasn't a legal term. It wasn't a crime. But in that room, in that moment, it felt heavier than a prison sentence. Pelosi tried to respond, her voice shaking slightly for the first time in decades. Senator Kennedy, I resent these insinuations. Insinuations? Kennedy's eyebrows rose, his face a mask of incredulity. Ma'am, these aren't insinuations. These are your own financial disclosure forms. These are your own words on video. These are your own voting records. I'm not insinuating anything. I'm reading what you filed with the federal government. He sat back down, his voice returning to that mild, conversational tone, but the damage was done. But you know what? I'm going to give you a chance to explain, right here, right now, under oath, in front of the American people, how did you make $250 million on a government salary? How did your husband consistently time his trades perfectly with legislative events? How do you justify living in a $30 million mansion while the people you represent sleep in tents? Kennedy folded his hands and waited, his expression one of patient expectation. The silence stretched. It grew uncomfortable, then painful. Pelosi opened her mouth several times, like a fish gasping for air, but seemed unable to form a coherent response. Her prepared talking points about compliance and free markets sounded hollow even to her own ears after Kennedy's systematic dismantling. Finally, she managed a weak, "My husband has built a successful business over many years." "Yes, ma'am. You've said that," Kennedy replied, his tone almost gentle now, like a teacher dealing with a student who hasn't done the reading. "But that's not an answer. That's a dodge. And the American people deserve better than dodges." He glanced at the committee chairman. "Mr. Chairman, I believe I've made my point. I have no further questions for this witness." As Kennedy gathered his papers, the gallery erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a release of pent-up frustration, a collective exhale from a public tired of being told it was raining while their leaders stood under umbrellas of gold. Democrats scrambled to distance themselves from what they'd just witnessed. Republicans took copious notes for future campaign ads. Media members frantically updated their headlines. And Nancy Pelosi sat at the witness table, her decades of Washington armor finally penetrated by the simple weapon of documented facts and folksy questions. The country lawyer from Louisiana had just delivered a masterclass in how to destroy a political opponent without ever raising your voice. The aftermath: fireflies, sweet tea, and a lion set loose. Far from the marble halls and the flashing cameras, the sun was setting over a very different kind of water. The Potomac River might be the lifeblood of Washington, but the bayou is the soul of Louisiana. Senator John Kennedy sat on the back porch of his modest home in Madisonville. It was a simple structure, worth perhaps $300,000, a rounding error in the Pelosi portfolio. He sat in a rocking chair that had seen better days, a glass of sweet tea sweating in his hand, condensation dripping onto his weathered knuckles. A local news crew from WDSU New Orleans was setting up on the lawn. They moved with a casual familiarity that was absent in D.C. The young reporter, visibly excited, adjusted her microphone. "Senator Kennedy," she began, the red light on the camera blinking to life, "your questioning of Nancy Pelosi has gone viral. Millions of views across social media. People are calling it a masterclass. How does it feel?" Kennedy took a slow sip of his tea, the ice clinking softly against the glass. He looked out over the water, where the fireflies were just beginning their nightly dance, blinking in the twilight like tiny, terrestrial stars. "Well, now, I wasn't trying to go viral," he said, his voice soft, thoughtful. "I was trying to ask some questions that I suspect a lot of regular folks have been wondering about for a long time. How does someone make $250 million while working in government? It's a fair question, isn't it?" Speaker Pelosi's office released a statement calling your questions a partisan attack designed to distract from real issues, the reporter pressed. Kennedy chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Well, she's entitled to her opinion. But I'll tell you what, those weren't partisan questions. Those were arithmetic questions. 2.7 million in 1987, 250 million today. That's just math. And math isn't partisan. Math doesn't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. It just is. Do you think she broke the law?" "I'm not a prosecutor," Kennedy replied, setting his glass down on the small wooden table beside him. And I'm not the one to make that determination. What I can say is that there's a big difference between what's legal and what's right. They might have made all those trades legally. The laws were written to allow it. But that doesn't make it right. It just makes it legal. He paused, looking back at the reporter, his eyes clear and direct. My daddy worked in a factory. He never made more than $40,000 a year in his life, but he was honest. He paid his taxes. He didn't cut corners. And when he passed, he didn't leave us millions of dollars. But he left us something more valuable, a good name. His word meant something. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking softly. I'd rather be poor and honest than rich and shameful. And I think most Americans feel the same way. They're not asking for their representatives to be perfect, but they are asking them to be honest, to play by the same rules everybody else plays by, to serve the public instead of serving themselves. The interview wrapped up as the last light faded from the sky. The crew packed their gear, chatting about LSU football and the upcoming crawfish season. Kennedy walked them to their van, shaking hands, asking about their families. After they left, he returned to his porch. His wife joined him, sitting in the chair next to his. You were pretty tough on her, she observed quietly. Kennedy nodded slowly. I was, but somebody needed to be. These folks in Washington, they've been playing by their own rules for too long. They've forgotten who they work for. Do you think anything will change? Maybe, Kennedy said, watching a firefly land on the railing. Maybe not, but at least people are talking about it now. At least they're asking questions. That's a start. He thought about the hearing room, the silence, the shock on Pelosi's face when the mask finally slipped. He thought about the millions of people who would watch the clips on their phones, realizing for the first time just how deep the rot went. You know what my mama used to say? He told his wife, a small smile touching his lips. She said, the truth is like a lion. You don't have to defend it. Just let it loose. It'll defend itself. He stood up, stretching his back, looking out at his hometown one more time. The air was thick and sweet, smelling of jasmine and river mud. I just let the truth loose today, he said softly. That's all. The rest will take care of itself. And somewhere in the darkness of the Louisiana night, a country lawyer sipped his sweet tea and smiled. The lion was out of the cage. And it was hungry.